Get started that if there ever was a Sunday to stay at home.
This is one of them.
I'm proud of y'all for being here. Snow, rain, 30 degrees, time change. Y'all are lucky I'm not in my pajamas.
You're lucky we are.
That's true. And I do send greetings to people who aren't here, who will see us later on YouTube. So there are 3 brief readings for this morning's message, and I thought I'd give them to you ahead of time. The first one is from the Christian Gospel of John, chapter 3. Now there was a Pharisee named Nicodemus, a leader of the Jews. And I'll paraphrase a little bit. He was actually a scholar and an elder of Israel, and even Jesus calls him an elder of Israel. He came to Jesus by night and said to him, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with that person." And then I'm paraphrasing again that with Nicodemus asking for clarification of what Jesus had been teaching through the weeks beforehand, Jesus explains at length how we are both flesh and of spirit, until finally Nicodemus just, I imagine, raises his hands and says, "How can these things be?" And then the story of Jesus's transfiguration is in all 3 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this is the version from Luke 9. After several days of speaking, Jesus took Peter, John, and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. And suddenly they saw 2 men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking about his exodus, which he was about to fulfill in Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but as they awoke, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us set up 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And while he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." And after the voice had spoken, they saw no one with them anymore, only Jesus. And a little more contemporary, I'd like to quote the final chorus of a song by Ellie Holcomb called "Constellations." I don't know if you've ever heard it. The chorus goes, "And out here in the dark, underneath a canopy of stars, constellations falling from your heart, they tell me that I'm not alone. I know that I'm never alone, 'cause you'll find me and bring me back home. And I'm never alone out here in the dark." It seems to me that it was just like yesterday that we were here talking about the Advent wreath and talking about the themes of Advent and the Christian tradition that's contained in that. But here we are, 11 weeks past that time called Christmas, and 33 years from the birth of the baby. We're on this countdown that some call Lent, celebrated as Easter, to the day celebrated as Easter by most Christians around the world. And so as I sat to discern the leading for today's message, there were a couple of threads that kept coming into play. It took a while for me to kind of put them together. First was my genuine curiosity about the Lenten season that many Christian traditions honor during the 40 days prior to Easter. I was wondering if there's a theme for each first day in Advent, is there a similar tradition for the themes of each first day in Lent? You wouldn't know I spent 30 years as a Methodist. I wasn't paying attention, I don't think. But it turns out there is actually themes for each first day. It just doesn't come with the wreath or the candles. In much of Christendom, today is the second Sunday in Lent. And the two stories that I read from Jesus' ministries are typically the theme for today. That questioning of Jesus by Nicodemus and Jesus' mountaintop transfiguration. Another thread that kept weaving in and out of my leading was this song, Constellations. It was actually a song that my 8-year-old granddaughter shared with me one summer night last year while we were on FaceTime. Thank goodness for FaceTime. I love it. After Kinsey had positioned her Squishmallow pillows in various poses for me to see, we have many views of the ceiling of their house. Thank you to FaceTime. Our conversation turned to the night sky because by this time I had wandered out into the yard and I was just gazing up at the sky, and I said something about the beautiful canopy of stars over my head. And Kinsey actually gasped, my favorite song talks about a canopy of stars. Like she was shocked I knew that phrase. That song turned out to be entitled Constellations and is sung by Ellie Holcomb. And I think that it's so worth listening to it in its entirety on YouTube that once the link to the message is posted online, I will include in the comments a link to Ellie's version of it. This song really summarizes what I feel is beneath these two Lenten stories, and even more so the foundation of the Easter story. So I want to circle back to the readings for a closer look. We learn about the Pharisee Nicodemus in the Christian Gospel of John only. I think that's the only place he's mentioned. And he's mentioned 3 different times in that Gospel. This time is the first story. And as far as we know as the readers, it's his first encounter with Jesus. But he comes to Jesus in the cloak of darkness, which that means secrecy, or perhaps privacy, but it means to not be seen. And given the fact that we know that Nicodemus is a well-educated member of the tribunal of Jewish elders called the Sanhedrin, remember that name? The very Sanhedrin that will soon condemn Jesus to death by crucifixion. Nicodemus actually was the one who argued on the Sanhedrin that Jesus could not be crucified until they had given him a fair trial with a judge. So he comes to Jesus in the dark of night, which maybe is to keep his respected standing on the Sanhedrin, or maybe even to save his life so that he wouldn't be associated with him. But he launches into a rabbinical debate, actually, 2 rabbis, about the meaning of this term Jesus keeps using about being born again. He seems to honestly desire to understand what Jesus is saying. And he keeps saying, but we're all born of the flesh. And Jesus says, yes, and it feels like Nicodemus remains in the dark. Because even after Jesus' explanation, I imagine him just doing like this and saying, how can these things be? And I love that honest question that he poses to Jesus. Well, the Gospels give us all kinds of details of how Jesus' ministry of miracles continues to expand. And the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke each contain a different version of the story of Jesus' transfiguration. And they go something like this. Taking a break from preaching to the crowds, Jesus goes up to the mountaintop to pray, and he brings with him James, John, and Peter. I'm beginning to think that maybe they were his prayer partners. You know, I have prayer partners. And we see this scene repeated just before Jesus' arrest, that they go with him into the Garden of Gethsemane for him to pray. And maybe it's also a foreshadowing of that time when we also read that Peter, John, and James find it nigh impossible to stay awake even during this transformative event. But so I'm imagining the four of them, Jesus and his closest compadres, and they're out there on a camp out underneath the starry skies, underneath a canopy of stars on the mountaintop. Maybe they've been staring up from their pallets as the fire dwindles, watching the Milky Way drift overhead, pointing out shooting stars to each other, definitely dozing off as Jesus prays off in the distance. But then all of a sudden, Jesus appears to glow like lightning in the dark night. The figures of Moses and Elijah can be seen chatting it up with Jesus. I don't know if the three apostles were scared out of their wits or if they're really too sleepy to comprehend what is going on around them. Maybe it's some of both. It kind of depends on which version, whose story you're reading. But not only do they see what they see, then they hear a voice from some rogue cloud that moves over them saying, "This is my son, listen to him." This voice is an echo back to the time of Jesus' baptism, when at the beginning of his ministry, not a cloud but a dove appears, and a voice is heard to say, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." But almost as quickly as the magnificent transfiguration of Jesus begins, they blink their sleepy eyes, and Jesus is standing there alone in front of them, as he was before, once again, out there in the dark. In these two gospel stories, we get a sense of a kind of seesaw between human and spirit. The debate between Jesus and Nicodemus around the birth of the human body in contrast to the birth in the spirit. From Jesus' perspective, it's a both and. We are both spirit and human and spirit. Bodies of flesh filled with the winds of spirit. And later on the mountaintop, Jesus is again filled, but this time with the light of spirit. You know, maybe it's the very light in which we hold people when we pray. And he isn't just filled with it, he is glowing. It's shining out from him, out there in the dark mountaintop. The fullness of his spirit is so present, and he is able to converse with two key Jewish prophets from the history of the Jews. The past meets the present. The dark is outshined by the light. The spirit realm merges with the human world. Jesus as a bridge of between dichotomies, shining forth the unifying Christ light. I imagine that Jesus bends down to touch the heads of his prayer partners who've collapsed not in prayer but in fear. He reminds them that he is still there in the flesh and yet filled with the light of spirit, although it can no longer be seen. He's been there and he will continue to be there. That light shines in and through each of us as well. I believe it has the power to transfigure us and transform us and others. And whether you're too afraid to let it shine, or maybe you're asleep to its presence, it reminds us that in every dark night we humans experience, no matter how confused or grieved or angry we are, how much we're suffering, or how lost we feel in the desert of faith, we're never alone. Just the same as Marcy prayed this morning, we're never alone. And as Ellie Holcomb sings in Constellations, when I felt the light of the moon on my face, the memory of sun that'd been shining for days, you've already been in this desolate place. You've already been here and you've made a way. Pinpricks of glory strung out across the sky, memories of darkness undone by the light, reminding me you are right here by my side. You're here by my side. You're here by my side. And out here in the dark, underneath a canopy of stars, constellations flowing from your heart, they tell me I'm not alone. I know I'm never alone, 'cause you'll find me and bring me back home. And I'm never alone out here in the dark. And that, my dear friends, to me, is the transformative, the transfiguring story of Easter. And so it is. Amen.